Callum Red planted sunflowers in a corn county. People laughed. Dale Cutler called it a waste of good ground, and the men at the feed store nodded, the way men nod when something confirms what they already believe.
As you can see from this
His own
chart,
father
the
looked
yield
out the kitchen
significantly
window
increased
and
after
said
the
nothing.
changes were implemented.
But what they
So the
didn't
correlation
know
here is
was
direct.
that Callum had a green notebook.
I finished the inspection
and
on the
inside
planner.
that notebook
We should
was
replace
6
these
years
Coulter
of
wheels
field
before we
trial
head out to the
data
East Field
from
this afternoon.
Illinois, and the
All right, you're good to go.
didn't
Thanks,
know
gentlemen.
how to laugh. If stories like this one mean
Careful on the
something
way
to
out.
you, stories about quiet courage and the
We have to
people who do
consider
the
what
right
this means
thing
for the family
before
farm.
anyone
It
else
won't be
believes
easy.
in it,
I understand the
consider
risks, but we
subscribing.
can't just ignore
It
the
costs
offer either.
nothing, and it means everything to a small channel trying to bring these stories to the people who need them most. Now, let's go back to the beginning. In the spring of 1987, every farmer in Harlan County, Nebraska, planted corn. This was not a decision. It was gravity. The same gravity that pulled the rainwater down through the dark topsoil, the same gravity that pulled the combines across the fields every October when the stalks were dry and the air smelled of dust and diesel. Nobody questioned it. You didn't question gravity. You didn't question corn. Not in Harlan County, not in 1987. Not unless you were 22 years old and had just come home from 4 years in Lincoln with a degree in agronomy, a minor in plant pathology, and a green spiral notebook that you carried everywhere, the way a carpenter carries a level, not as an affectation, but as a tool. Let me tell you about Harlan County first, because you need to understand the place before you can understand what happened in it. The county sits in south-central Nebraska like a patient man waiting for something he knows is coming. The land is wide and flat, and the sky above it is enormous in a way that takes getting used to if you've been away. The soil is dark in the river bottoms, lighter on the uplands, and in the sandy northeast corners of the oldest farms it runs almost done in a dry summer. Glaciers shaped it. Centuries of big bluestem and switchgrass composted into it. The organic matter content in a good Harlan County bottom field was the kind of thing that made extension agronomists from out of state go quiet when they knelt down and picked up a handful, turning it over in their fingers like something valuable, which it was. There were in 1987 somewhere close to 340 working farms in Harlan County. Of those, all but a small handful planted corn as their primary crop. A few ran corn and soybeans in rotation swapping fields every other year the way their fathers had shown them. A few planted oats in the wet back corners where drainage made corn unreliable. But corn was the anchor. Corn was what the grain elevator on the east edge of Alma was sized for. Corn was what the equipment dealers stocked their lots with. Corn was what the county extension office built its January meetings around when the new hybrids came out and the seed reps came in from Omaha with their yield data and their sample bags and their confidence. Harlan County was a corn county. It had been a corn county since before the First World War. It intended to remain one. And in the spring of 1987, there was not a single person in it who would have told you otherwise. The Red family had farmed 480 acres in the northeast corner of the county since 1921, when Einar Red arrived from Värmland, Sweden, with a young wife, 2 sons under the age of 5, and enough money saved from 3 years of foundry work in Omaha to buy the land outright and put a team of horses in the barn by the end of October. Einar's son Birger took the farm in 1949. Birger's son Eldon took it in 1974. By 1987, Eldon Red was 54 years old and had been farming the same 480 acres for 13 years with the same careful, methodical attention that his father had brought to it and his grandfather before that. Eldon was not a complicated man in the way people sometimes mean that as a compliment. He was precise. He kept his equipment in the same shed it had always been in, maintained on the same schedule, in the same order of priority. He planted within the same 2-week window every spring, the window his father had identified as optimal for that particular piece of ground, and that the data had never given him reason to revise. He rotated his corn and soybeans on the same schedule Birger had used. He kept records, a leather-bound ledger on the shelf above the desk in the room off the kitchen, 1 volume per decade, the handwriting consistent across all 3 decades, because Eldon had learned to write the same way he had learned to farm from a man who did not tolerate sloppiness in either. His yields were consistent. His debt was manageable, his reputation at the co-op and the feed store and the elevator was the reputation of a man who knew what he was doing and did not deviate from it without reason. When Eldon Red said a field was ready to plant, the men around him believed him. He had been right about it for 13 years running, and there was no particular reason to expect year 14 to be different. Callum Red was 22 years old in the spring of 1987. He had graduated the previous May from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln with a degree in agronomy and a minor in plant pathology. He had driven home from Lincoln with his boxes in the back of his truck and his green notebook on the passenger seat, and he had pulled into the lane of the Red farm on a Sunday afternoon in late May and sat in the truck for a moment before getting out, looking at the south field through the windshield. The corn his father had planted 2 weeks earlier was already 3 inches tall even and cleaned the rows straight as sentences across the dark ground. He knew this place the way you know a person you grew up beside. He knew the northeast corner flooded in a wet April, and that the water table was too close to the surface for consistent corn production on the sandy ground up there. He knew the south field had a compaction problem from years of running equipment on wet ground in October, a problem his father managed but had never fully solved. He knew the drainage ditch along the back fence line had cost them 2 corn crops in the last decade when the spring rains came in heavy and stayed. He knew the farm the way you know a thing, you love its virtues and its failures both and the history behind each one. What Callum also knew by the time he drove home that Sunday was something he had not learned on the farm. He had learned it in a classroom in Lincoln in the 2nd semester of his junior year in a course on integrated pest management taught by a professor named Dr. Harlan Varden. Dr. Varden was not a popular man with the seed dealers who occasionally attended his lectures. He had a habit of saying things that made them uncomfortable, things backed by data from multi-year field trials in Illinois and Minnesota and Nebraska, things the data said plainly, but that the industry preferred not to advertise. Dr. Varden had a phrase he used so often that his students wrote it on the inside covers of their notebooks. Callum had written it on the inside cover of the green one. Monoculture is a loan you take out against disaster. He had underlined it twice, not because it was dramatic. Dr. Varden was not a dramatic man, but because it was precise, and Callum valued precision in language the same way his father valued it in the placement of seed, because imprecision was where things went wrong. He had another phrase too, one he used the first day of class, and the last one that Callum heard him say to a skeptical seed rep who sat in on a lecture in November and challenged the Illinois trial methodology with a confidence that had not read the Illinois trial. Dr. Varden had looked at the man for a moment and said simply, "Show me the data," not as a challenge, as an invitation, as the only honest response to any claim about how the ground works, because the ground does not negotiate with belief, only with observation, only with measurement, only with the patient accumulation of what is actually there. Callum wrote it under the other phrase on the inside cover of the green notebook. "Show me the data." What the first phrase meant, Dr. Varden explained it simply because he believed simple explanations were the most honest kind. Was this: when a field grows only one crop year after year, it builds an environment perfectly calibrated for the pests and pathogens that feed on that crop. Those populations grow, they adapt, they develop resistance to chemical controls. The soil biology shifts in their favor. A monoculture farm is not simply a farm growing one thing, it is a farm spending years constructing the ideal conditions for its own destruction. Callum had written all of this down. He had written down the field trial data too. In a study conducted across 12 farms in central Illinois between 1979 and 1985 farms that incorporated at least 2 non-host crops into their rotation showed an average of 34% lower pest pressure than farms running continuous corn or corn-soybean only. The pest populations on diversified farms didn't disappear. They cycled. They had natural checks. They never built the kind of sustained concentrated pressure that could devastate a single crop across an entire county in a single season. The diversified farms also showed a 19% improvement in soil aggregate stability over the 6-year period, which translated to better water retention in dry years and better drainage in wet ones. The numbers were not preliminary. They were 6 years of data from 12 farms, and they said the same thing every single year. Any farm that grows only one thing is a farm that needs only one disaster to fail. Callum had also read the second paper that Dr. Varden assigned in the 4th week of the semester, an analysis from the University of Minnesota Extension Service examining the economic performance of diversified small grain and legume rotations in the upper Midwest between 1975 and 1982. The paper compared per acre net revenue on farms using 3-crop and 4-crop rotations against farms using corn-soybean only. In 5 of the 7 years studied, the diversified farms outperformed on a per-acre net basis. Not because their gross yields were higher, because their input costs were lower, and their risk was distributed across multiple markets instead of concentrated in one. In the 2 years that diversified farms underperformed, they underperformed by an average of $11 per acre. In the 5 years they outperformed by an average of $38 per acre. Over 7 years, the math was not close. Callum came home from Lincoln with all of this in the green notebook. He carried the notebook into the kitchen on a Thursday evening in early March of 1987, and he sat down across from his father at the oak table, and he told him He wanted to try something different. Let me tell you about that kitchen, because it matters. It was a practical room, not decorated so much as accumulated the table oak and scarred, bought in 1958, with the kind of dents and stains that meant it had been used for everything a table could be used for, from shelling corn to writing school papers to laying out seed catalogs in January. There was a window above the sink that looked south across the field, and in March the field was still winter gray, the chopped stalks from last fall lying in rows across the dark ground, waiting for the disc. The overhead light was fluorescent and a little too bright for the room, the way farm kitchens sometimes are, as though the house itself wanted to make sure nothing was missed. Eldon sat at the head of the table with his coffee and his seed catalogue. Rosalie was at the counter, her back to them, washing a pan. Callum opened the green notebook to the revenue comparison table and set it in front of his father and told him about Dr. Varden and the Illinois trials and the Minnesota study. He told him he wanted to plant 80 acres in sunflowers on the sandy northeast corner where the corn had never produced well anyway. He wanted to seed hairy vetch along the drainage strip as a cover crop and nitrogen fixer. He wanted to put winter wheat on the wet ground near the back fence where the water table made corn unreliable. He had the input costs worked out. He had a contact at the elevator in Kearney that was buying sunflower seed at 11 cents a pound. He had projected a yield of 1,400 pounds per acre on the sandy ground, which at 11 cents was a gross of $154 per acre against an input cost of around $40. His father's corn on that same sandy ground had netted $31 per acre the previous year. Eldon listened. He was a man who had learned, and this is rarer than it sounds to listen before he spoke. He picked up the notebook. He turned the pages slowly, the way a man reads something he genuinely wants to understand, rather than something he's looking for reasons to dismiss. He looked at the Illinois data. He looked at the Minnesota revenue table. He looked at the projected yield numbers and the Kearney elevator contact and the input cost breakdown Callum had written in a column along the right margin. When he reached the last page, he set the notebook down on the table and picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the south field for a long time. The room was quiet except for the sound of water running at the counter. "I need to think about it," Eldon said. That was a Thursday. By Saturday morning, Eldon came out to the barn where Callum was checking the planter bearings and stood in the door with his coffee and told his son he could plant 80 acres his way. The back 40 on the sandy northeast corner and the wet strip along the drainage ditch. 80 acres out of 480. Not a revolution, a test. Callum set down the bearing he was holding and looked at his father. "Thank you," he said. Eldon nodded once and went back to the house. Callum picked up the green notebook from the workbench where it had been sitting open and turned to a blank page and wrote the date at the top and began his planting schedule. It was then that Eldon stopped in the barn doorway, one hand on the frame, not quite turning back. "I tried it once," Eldon said. "Sunflowers, 1971, before you were old enough to remember." Callum looked up. "What happened?" Eldon was quiet for a moment. "The field came in thin. I didn't have the data you have, didn't know about the phosphate amendment or the row spacing, didn't have a buyer lined up. Hauled 2 loads to Grand Island, and they docked me heavy for moisture. Lost money." He paused. "I didn't tell you sooner, because I didn't want to discourage you before you had a chance to think it through yourself." Callum held the pen above the notebook page and looked at his father for a moment. This careful, precise private man standing in the barn door he had stood in for 30 years. He understood in that moment that the 80-acre concession had not been reluctant. It had been something else. It had been a man who had carried a quiet failure for 16 years, deciding that his son's knowledge deserved the room to prove something different. That was the first twist in this story, not the failure of 1971, the 16 years of silence around it, and what the silence meant, and what it cost Eldon to end it. Callum wrote a note in the margin of the planting schedule. Not numbers, just 4 words. He kept them. In March, Callum drove into Alma to pick up a specific phosphate amendment from the feed store, a formulation that Dr. Varden had recommended for establishing vetch on ground that had been in continuous corn, where the soil biology had been simplified by years of the same inputs and needed encouragement towards something more complex. The feed store was the only place in the county that stocked it. He was wearing his University of Nebraska jacket, green with red lettering. He was carrying the green notebook because he carried it everywhere that spring, and he had learned by then to stop explaining why. Dale Cutler was behind the counter when Callum walked in. Dale was 56 years old and had been the primary seed and chemical dealer for the northeast quarter of Harlan County for 19 years. He was not a dishonest man. He had built something real, a business, a reputation, a network of trust that ran through every farm in his territory. He had helped a lot of farmers in Harlan County make money, and he knew it and they knew it, and that knowledge had given him a particular kind of authority. The kind that lives in a room before you do. The kind you don't have to announce. Hal Denton was at the counter with his coffee, 2 other men whose names Callum knew from church and the elevator. Dale asked him what he was after, and Callum told him, and told him why. He told him about the rotation plan, because he was 22 years old and had not yet learned the particular kind of discretion that comes from being burned by a conversation you didn't need to have. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Dale Cutler smiled, and then he laughed, and Callum would remember that laugh for a long time after, not because it was cruel, it wasn't, but because of what it was instead. It was patient, almost fond, the way you laugh when a child says something that reveals a genuine misunderstanding of how the world works. Not contemptuous, not threatened, just certain, with the easy certainty of a man who has never had reason to doubt the ground he stands on. Sunflowers, Dale said, in a corn county. He said it the way you'd say swimming in the Sahara. Not hostile, just categorically confused. Hal Denton shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at something he's already decided about. "Your daddy know about this?" Hal asked. "He knows," Callum said. He agreed. Hal and Dale exchanged a look, brief, barely perceptible, the look of men who have communicated a shared opinion so many times they no longer need words to do it. Callum set the green notebook on the counter and opened it to the revenue comparison table from the Minnesota study. He told them about the Illinois trials. He told them the Kearney elevator was buying at 11 cents a pound, and his projected net on the sandy northeast corner was in the neighborhood of $95 per acre against $31 for corn on the same ground the previous year. Dale looked at the table. He looked at it the way a man looks at a document, printed in a language he doesn't speak, not uninterested exactly, but not engaged either, as though the symbols are real, but the meaning is somehow not accessible to him in the way he needs it to be. Those are Illinois numbers, Dale said. This is Nebraska. The soil types are comparable, Callum said. The pest pressure dynamics are the same. Dr. Varden ran the correlation across 6 states. Market's different. You can't move sunflowers out of this county. No elevator for them. You'd be hauling to Kearney at minimum, and that eats your margin. I already called the Kearney elevator. Callum's voice was even. They're buying at 11 cents a pound. My projected yield on that sandy ground is 1,400 pounds per acre. That's 154 gross against $40 in inputs. Dale looked at him for a moment. The smile was still there, but it had gotten smaller. That's your projection, Dale said. First year, no experience with the crop. That's correct, Callum said. That's why we're starting with 80 acres. Dale sold him the phosphate amendment. He didn't say anything further about the sunflowers, or the vetch, or the rotation plan. But as Callum was walking out the door, he heard Hal Denton say something to the men behind him, something he didn't catch completely. The word he caught was Lincoln. And the tone was the tone of a man explaining why a thing doesn't apply here. Callum drove home on the county road with the windows down and the notebook on the passenger seat open to the planting schedule. He didn't say anything to anyone about what had happened at the feed store. He went to the barn, and he kept planning. Let me tell you what happened in that kitchen the following Tuesday evening, because it is the second thing in this story that no one outside the family knew. Callum had been at the desk in the room of the kitchen, working on his vetch seeding rates, when he heard his parents' voices from the kitchen, not loud, just the particular register of a conversation that has weight to it, the kind of conversation that 2 people who have been married for 26 years have at the end of a long day when the kids are supposedly occupied elsewhere. He didn't intend to listen, but the house was small and the walls were the walls of a farmhouse built in 1931, and he heard. Rosalie's voice came through steady and unhurried, the voice of a woman who has chosen her moment and knows what she wants to say in it. I've been keeping these books for 22 years, she said, and I want to tell you something. That wet strip along the fence has cost us money in 7 of the last 10 years. And the sandy northeast corner has never not once broken even on corn. Not in a good year, not in the best year we ever had. Eldon didn't answer right away. She kept going. The boy did the math right, she said. I checked it. The Illinois numbers are sound, and the Minnesota study is sound, and 11 cents a pound at Kearney is real, because I called the elevator myself this morning to verify. A pause. It won't cost us anything to let him try. Eldon's voice, when it came, was quiet. I know, he said. Then Rosalie said, I know you know. And the conversation ended there, not with resolution so much as with something understood between 2 people who had arrived at the same place from different directions and didn't need to make a ceremony of it. Callum sat at the desk for a moment with his pen in his hand and didn't write anything. He had thought he was doing this with his father's cautious permission. He had not known until that moment that his mother had been doing the math in silence for weeks, had called the Kearney elevator herself, and had brought her own weight to bear on the decision in the way she always brought weight to things quietly, without announcement, after she had checked the numbers twice. That was the second twist, not Rosalie's intervention, but the years of careful, unremarked arithmetic behind it, the 22 years of ledger entries and risk assessments she had never stopped making, the way she had been the farm's memory of what had cost them and what hadn't, and the fact that this time her numbers and her son's numbers pointed in exactly the same direction. Callum turned back to the planting schedule and wrote his mother's name in the margin next to the vetch seeding rates, not as a record, as a reminder of what it felt like to find out that you had not been as alone in something as you had believed. The green notebook was filling up. April came in cold and wet. 3 inches of rain in the first 2 weeks, ground temperatures that stayed below 50 degrees until the 23rd. Eldon watched his planting window compress and made the decision to wait. It was the right decision. The corn he put in the first week of May went into ground that was ready, and it came up clean and even. Callum planted his 80 acres in 2 phases. The winter wheat and the hairy vetch went in first, broadcast seeded, along the drainage strip in late April, while the ground was still soft enough to accept them. The vetch was a nitrogen fixer. Dr. Varden had recommended it specifically for ground that had been in continuous corn soil biology, simplified by years of the same inputs, nitrogen, drawn down microbial diversity, reduced to the minimum required for one crop's cycle. The vetch would put 80 to 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre back into that ground by the time it was turned under, which meant the following year's corn on that strip would need significantly less synthetic nitrogen. Callum had run the math on that calculation 3 times. It held every time. The sunflowers went in the second week of May on the sandy northeast corner, rose 30 inches apart, a population of 18,000 seeds per acre, an open-pollinated variety. Dr. Varden had recommended 90-day maturity would come out of the ground well before the first frost in a normal Nebraska fall. No insecticide at planting, a reduced-rate herbicide on a split application schedule. Total planting cost on those 40 acres, $41 per acre, against $67 per acre for Eldon's corn ground. Callum wrote all of it in the green notebook. Every input, every cost, every date. The neighbors noticed. It is impossible in a county of 340 farms on flat ground with long sightlines to do something different without people noticing. By the 3rd week of May, when the sunflowers were 2 inches tall and clearly unmistakably not corn, 3 different farmers had slowed their trucks on the county road to look. One of them stopped, got out, walked to the fence line, and stood there for a full minute before driving on. Callum watched this from the barn and felt something he would later try to put words to in the notebook, a combination of steadiness and exposure. The particular feeling of having committed to something that cannot be uncommitted, something that will now either prove itself or fail in front of everyone who doubted it. He picked up the green notebook from the workbench and added a line to his observation log. The sunflowers were growing. At the feed store that Thursday, Dale Cutler told the men at the counter that Eldon Red's boy had planted sunflowers on the northeast corner. Hal Denton said he'd driven past and seen them. Someone else said it was a shame to put that ground into something that couldn't be moved without a haul to Kearney. Dale said it wasn't good ground to begin with, which was true, and that it still seemed like a college idea more than a farm idea, which in his view it was. Nobody at the counter said anything in favor of it. Nobody at the counter had read the Minnesota study. The sunflowers grew through May and into June, and the green notebook grew with them seeding emergence dates, soil temperature logs, early pest pressure Observations, rainfall measurements taken from the gauge Callum had installed on the fence post at the northeast corner. The rows were straight. The stand was even. On the last day of May, Callum knelt at the edge of the field and pushed his fingers into the soil between the rows and felt how different it already was from the adjacent corn ground, the texture lighter, the residual moisture deeper, the faint smell of something biological beginning to wake up in the dirt. He wrote that down, too, not the numbers this time, just what it smelled like, just what it felt like to put his hand into a piece of ground that everyone around him had written off and find that it was answering. The green notebook was on the workbench when he stood up, its cover sun-faded at the corners, now its pages swelling slightly from the humidity of a Nebraska spring. He picked it up and walked back toward the barn, and the sunflowers, still small, still unproven, stood in their rows behind him in the afternoon light, saying nothing, doing the only thing that had ever been asked of them. Growing. The summer came in the way Nebraska summers do not gradually, but all at once, like a door thrown open onto heat and light, and the particular smell of growing things under pressure. By the second week of June, the corn across Harlan County was knee-high and dark green, and everything that a corn county asked it to be. The men at the feed store talked about it the way they always talked about a good stand, with a satisfaction that was almost proprietary, as though the corn's success was also theirs, which in a way it was. Callum walked his 80 acres every evening after supper. He had started the walks as a disciplined, systematic observation, the way Dr. Varden had taught it, moving through the rows in a methodical pattern and recording what he found in the green notebook. Pest pressure, weed competition, soil moisture at the surface and 6 inches down, emergence counts on the veg strip, growth stage on the sunflowers. He had a protocol written out on the first page of the observation log section, and he followed it the way his father followed a planting schedule, because protocol was what kept observation honest. But the walks became something else over time, something he didn't have a technical term for. The sunflowers in the northeast corner had grown past his knee by the first week of June, their stems thickening their root systems, pushing down into the sandy soil in a way that corn roots never had, deeper, more persistent following moisture into layers of the profile that a corn root reached for and found insufficient and turned away from. In a dry stretch in the third week of June, 5 days without rain and temperatures above 90, the corn in the adjacent field began to show the early signs of moisture stress. The lower leaves rolled slightly at the margins, the color shifting just perceptibly toward a duller green. Callum measured it because he measured everything, and the shift was real. He walked to the fence line and looked at the sunflowers. They showed nothing. They stood straight and dark, their heads not yet formed, their stems unwavering in the hot afternoon, drawing on reserves of moisture 4 feet below the surface, while the corn beside them reached down 2 feet and found the tank running low. Callum wrote it in the notebook and stood there for a while in the heat, not writing anything else, just watching. He had read this in the literature. He had expected it technically. But there is a difference between expecting something because a paper told you to, and watching it happen in a field you've walked since you were old enough to walk, in a corner of ground your father had written off as marginal before you were born. The difference is not something you can put in a data table. He tried anyway in a small note at the bottom of the observation log. The vetch on the drainage strip was doing what it was supposed to do, and more. It had fixed nitrogen into the soil. The April and June samples confirmed it. the numbers already trending above the adjacent corn ground by a margin that would compound over winter. It had suppressed weeds along a strip that had historically grown more thistle than anything Eldon deliberately planted, and it had held the soil during 2 heavy rains in May, rains that in previous years had moved a visible amount of topsoil off that strip and into the ditch. The ditch was cleaned this year. The strip was intact. Callum had not expected that last part, not so quickly, not in the first season. He photographed it with his father's old camera and put the prints in the back of the green notebook. But the summer was also where he learned things the notebook had not prepared him for. In the 3rd week of June, he found a population of sunflower moth larvae in the northeast corner, not catastrophic, not even close to the economic threshold Dr. Varden had described in his notes on integrated pest management, but real visible, the small grey larvae curled inside the developing leaf axils of the plants in the northeast most rows, the ones closest to a hedgerow that ran along the county road. He had not anticipated this specific pressure from this specific direction. The hedgerow was a habitat reservoir. He understood that in retrospect, the way you understand things in retrospect, when the data arrives to explain what you've already observed. He had no spray protocol ready, because he had not planned for larvae at this stage, at this location, at this density. He called Dr. Varden from the kitchen phone on a Tuesday evening. Dr. Varden answered on the 3rd ring and listened without interrupting, while Callum described what he'd found, the location, the density, the growth stage of the affected plants, the proximity to the hedgerow. When Callum finished, there was a brief silence on the line, the silence of a man thinking rather than the silence of a man uncertain. "You're below threshold," Dr. Varden said, "probably well below, but that hedgerow is a variable you'll want to account for in future years. What I do now is this." He walked Callum through a scouting protocol specific to sunflower moth at pre-head formation, with threshold numbers and a contact insecticide option to hold in reserve if counts exceeded them. He told Callum where to find the University of Nebraska Extension Bulletin on Sunflower Pest Management Bulletin number 143, updated in 1985, which his county extension office should have on file. Callum wrote it all down in the green notebook. "Is this going to cost me the field?" Callum asked. Dr. Varden was quiet for a moment, not with hesitation, with the specific consideration of a man who doesn't believe in false reassurance. "Not if you scout it right," Dr. Varden said, "but scout it right. Don't guess. Count." Callum counted. Every 2 days for the next 3 weeks, moving through the affected rows in the protocol Dr. Varden had described, recording counts by plant in the observation log. The population peaked in the 1st week of July and then declined natural predation, primarily a small population of parasitic wasps that Callum identified from Dr. Varden's bulletin, working the hedgerow and the adjacent rows, doing the work that a diverse field margin allowed them to do. He never applied the insecticide. He watched the wasps instead, and he wrote down what he saw, and he added a section to the observation log he hadn't planned for beneficial insect activity by date and location. He told Dr. Varden about the wasps in a follow-up call in late July. "That's not an accident," Dr. Varden said. "That's what happens when you give the system room to work. You didn't manage that. You just didn't prevent it." Callum wrote that down too. The summer moved through July and into August, and the sunflowers moved with it. Their heads formed in late June, first the small green buds at the center of the developing phase, then the slow unfurling of the ray petals, yellow and vivid against the brown of the dry sandy ground. By mid-July, the northeast corner of the red farm had become a thing that people slowed down to look at on the county road, which was not a road known for scenery, which was a road that had looked the same, more or less, since the 1940s. An older farmer named Gus Bellamy, who ran 300 acres 2 miles to the east, and who had not spoken more than 10 words to Callum, since Callum was in high school, stopped his truck one morning and got out and walked to the fence and stood there for a long time. Callum was at the far end of the field doing his scout count and saw the man standing there and walked over. Gus Bellamy was 71 years old and had farmed in Harlan County since 1952. He looked at the sunflowers, and he looked at Callum, and he looked at the green notebook under Callum's arm. "Your granddad tried a thing like this once," Gus said. "Not sunflowers." Milo, in the back corner. Everybody thought he was wrong. "Was he?" Callum asked. Gus shrugged the shrug of a man who has watched enough seasons to know that wrong and right are frequently determined by timing rather than principle. "He was early," Gus said. "That's a different thing." He looked at the sunflowers for another moment, then walked back to his truck and drove on without saying anything else. But the following Saturday morning, a small package appeared on the Red Farm's front porch, a paper bag folded at the top, no note containing a handful of what turned out to be open-pollinated sunflower seed from a variety Gus Bellamy had been saving since 1974, a drought-tolerant variety his own father had grown on the dry upland ground, and which Callum had never heard of, and which was not in any catalogue he owned. Callum planted a test row of it along the fence line and wrote the variety name, transcribed from the handwriting on a slip of paper tucked inside the seed bag in the green notebook. He did not know, until much later, how much that seed would matter. It was also in July that Callum first understood what was happening to the rootworm population in the northeast corner. Western corn rootworm had been a cost in Harlan County for as long as anyone at the feed store could remember, not a crisis, a cost, $14 per acre in soil insecticide applied at planting across most of the corn ground in the county. Yield drag on fields where the application had been uneven or where the population ran higher than the label rate controlled, a cost that everyone paid and no one questioned because it was the cost of growing corn in a corn county, and the cost of growing corn in a corn county was what you paid if you were a corn county, and Harlan County was. The rotation-resistant variant had been spreading through the county since at least 1985. It had learned through the ordinary logic of evolutionary pressure to lay its eggs in soybean fields so that its larvae hatched into the corn that would inevitably follow. Farms running corn-soybean rotation, the responsible, the careful, the orthodox, were not exempt. The pest had adapted specifically to them. Callum had been running sticky traps across the farm since the second week of June, yellow panel traps positioned at regular intervals across the corn ground and along the boundaries of the sunflower and veg fields, checked every 7 days, the beetle counts logged by location in the observation log. The pattern that emerged by mid-July was not subtle. The trap counts in the northeast corner, in the sunflower ground and immediately adjacent to it, were running at approximately a third of the counts in the corn ground, 2 fields to the south. The sunflowers were a dead end for Rootworm. The adults could fly into the corner, could land on the sunflower leaves, could find nothing useful there and move on. But the larvae that hatched in that ground the previous fall, expecting corn and finding sunflowers, had not completed their life cycle. That generation was simply gone, and the generation that followed was correspondingly smaller. Callum had not expected this to be visible in the first season. It was visible in the first season. He mapped the trap counts onto a rough diagram of the farm and looked at it for a long time. The numbers decreased incrementally as you moved from the center of the corn ground toward the sunflower boundary, not a sharp line, but a slope, a measurable decline that followed the edges of the rotation break the way a shadow follows the angle of light. The suppression wasn't stopping at the fence line. It was reaching into Hal Denton's ground to the south. The 40 acres of sunflowers in the northeast corner were functioning as something he hadn't planned, for something that wasn't in any of the papers he had read, a buffer, a biological interruption that extended its effect beyond its own boundaries. He added a section to the observation log he hadn't labeled before. Population suppression, mechanism rotation break, evidence sticky trap differential by field end date. He brought the map to his father that evening. Eldon looked at it at the kitchen table, turning it slowly, following the numbers from one field to the next. "This is 1 year," Eldon said. "Careful." "I know," Callum said. "But look at the gradient." Eldon looked at the gradient. Then he set the map down and picked up his coffee and looked at his son, in the way he looked at things he was thinking about seriously, without needing to say so. "Keep counting," he said. Callum kept counting. The harvest came in the 3rd week of September. Callum had arranged to borrow a row crop header from a farmer in Phelps County named Irv Stout, who had grown sunflowers for 4 years and who had driven over in August to look at the red field and said without particular drama that the stand looked better than his own first year. Callum ran the combine himself, starting at 6 in the morning, when the dew was still on the heads and the air smelled of the particular dry sweetness of ripe sunflower, a smell he had not encountered before and which he would recognize without hesitation for the rest of his life. He finished at 4 in the afternoon, when the shadows were running long across the harvested ground, and the empty field had the clean, purposeful look of a thing that had been used well. The yield was 1,510 pounds per acre, 110 pounds above his projection. He hauled 3 loads to the elevator in Kearney across 2 days driving the county road before sunrise, with the loaded grain cart behind him, the headlights cutting through the early dark. He came home with a net of $97 per acre after all inputs and hauling costs. His father's corn on the comparable sandy ground, the light upland acres on the south field. The ground most similar in character to the northeast corner had netted $44 per acre that year. Callum sat at the kitchen table that evening and opened the green notebook to a fresh page and wrote both numbers side by side. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked up. Eldon was across the table with his coffee and the seed catalogue, though the catalogue was closed. "The veg data won't be complete until spring," Callum said. "The full nitrogen credit won't show until next year's corn on that strip." "I know," Eldon said, "but the sunflower numbers are real." I can see that, Eldon said. He did not say his son was right. He did not say he himself had been wrong. He picked up the green notebook and looked at the soil sample comparison from the drainage strip the April baseline against the September follow-up, the organic matter percentage ticking upward, the nitrogen numbers moving in the direction that the vetch was supposed to move them. "What's your confidence level on the vetch nitrogen credit?" Eldon asked. 80 to 120 pounds per acre, Callum said, depending on how long the stand had before we turn it under. The high end if we wait until May. That would offset how much synthetic nitrogen on that strip next year. Most of it, Callum said. Maybe all of it at 120. I want to run a split field trial, half with the standard nitrogen rate, half with a reduced rate, and see what the yield response is. Eldon looked at him. "That's a good idea," Eldon said. It was a simple statement, 4 words, and Callum would remember it later as the first time his father had said those specific words about anything Callum had proposed since he came home from Lincoln, and the memory of it would sit in him with a particular weight that had nothing to do with agronomy. Rosalie came in from the garden while they were talking and poured herself a coffee and sat down. She listened for a moment, her hands around the cup. Then she set the cup down and went to the drawer beside the refrigerator, the deep drawer, the one that held the farm's accumulated paper history, and came back with a folded sheet that had gone soft at the creases from years of being folded and unfolded. She set it on the table between them without a word. Callum picked it up. It was a handwritten calculation, the paper yellowed at the edges, the pencil faint in places, but legible, a revenue comparison between corn only and a 3-crop rotation, including oats and a legume cover. The numbers were from 1979. The handwriting was Rosalie's. He looked at his mother. "I did the math once too," Rosalie said. Her voice was even without accusation. "You just needed someone else to do it again." Eldon looked at the paper for a long moment, then he looked at his wife. The look between them lasted only a second, but it held 20 years of conversation inside it. The 1979 proposal, he had declined the books she had kept in silence since the Tuesday evening when she had called the Kearney elevator herself and said nothing about it until the right moment arrived. Callum held the paper carefully, the way you hold something that has waited a long time to be useful, and laid it open beside the green notebook on the table. 2 sets of numbers, 18 years apart, written in different hands, arriving at the same place. He did not say anything, neither did Eldon, neither did Rosalie. Some things don't need saying, they just need to be on the table. They talked for an hour. When the kitchen finally went quiet and Rosalie cleared the cups and the November dark pressed against the window over the sink, something in the room had shifted not dramatically but permanently, the way a river shifts its course, not all at once, but in a direction it doesn't reverse. The winter came early that year, the first frost in the 3rd week of October, and Callum spent it the way he had spent the previous winter, reading. Dr. Varden sent him 2 new papers in November, a study from South Dakota State on sunflower corn rotation effects on rootworm population dynamics over 3 seasons, and a preliminary report from a Nebraska field trial on soil health indicators in diversified small grain systems. Both confirmed what the Green Notebook had started to show. Both went further than it had. He read them at the kitchen table and wrote in the notebook and planned. He wanted to expand. 120 acres for the following year, the full northeast corner at 80 acres plus an additional 40 on the wet ground along the south fence where the drainage had historically made corn unreliable. He wanted to formalize the rootworm trap protocol and extend it across the whole farm, not just the boundary fields. He wanted to establish the nitrogen split trial on the veg strip to quantify the synthetic input savings precisely. He brought the plan to his father in February. Eldon looked at it. He said he needed to think about it. Rosalie was in the kitchen. When this happened, she said nothing. She looked at Eldon in a way that communicated something specific, and Eldon looked at her in a way that communicated that he had received it. 3 days later, Eldon came to the barn where Callum was going over the planter and said he could expand to 120 acres, a quarter of the farm. The spring of 1989 arrived with the particular cruelty of a season that looks normal until it doesn't. April was fine. May was fine. The corn went in across Harlan County on schedule, the planters running in their familiar patterns across the dark fields, the seed going into warm ground at the right depth and the right spacing, everything calibrated to the tolerances that experience had established as correct. The stands came up clean, the canopy closed on schedule. In July, when the agronomist from the county extension office drove his routes, he noted in his field reports that Harlan County corn was as good as it had been in several years. The rootworm was in those fields. It had been building for years, patient in the way that organisms are patient when evolution is doing the work, not planning, just accumulating generation by generation, the rotation-resistant variant spreading through the county's corn-soybean farms with the quiet efficiency of something that had adapted perfectly to its environment. The environment it had adapted to was the environment that 340 farms in Harlan County had spent 20 years building for it. Callum's trap counts in June 1989 showed the highest adult beetle numbers he had recorded since he started trapping in 1988, not on his sunflower ground, on the corn ground. The numbers in the adjacent fields, Hal Denton's ground to the south, the Frey brothers' ground to the west, were running well above the economic threshold that the extension bulletins used to define a serious infestation. He wrote it down. He noted the date. He looked at the gradient map now in its third year and saw what the gradient was becoming. The larvae fed through June and July. The damage was underground, invisible, the root systems of the corn plants being consumed below the surface, while the plants above continued to look to a casual observer more or less normal. A farmer walking his fields in July would see a good stand. He would not see what was happening at the root crown. He would not know until August, when the plants that had been feeding normally began to run low on the structural support that held them upright. The tilting started in the first week of August. Callum saw it in Hal Denton's field first, the rows that had been vertical in July, beginning to lean not dramatically, not all at once, but with the incremental list of something whose foundation has been taken from it. He drove the county road one morning and looked at it from the truck window and felt something that was not satisfaction, not even close to satisfaction, but was instead the specific uncomfortable feeling of having been right about something you had not wanted to be right about. He walked his own corn ground that afternoon. The fields adjacent to the sunflower and vetch acres, the ones that had been inside the gradient on his trap maps for 2 years, showed lower pressure than the fields further from the rotation break, still affected, still showing some root damage, but measurably less than the county around them. He wrote the measurements in the green notebook and did not feel good about them. The line of thunderstorms came through on the 14th of August. It was not a severe system, no rotation, no hail. Just a line of storms moving in from the northwest, sustained winds in the 40-mile-an-hour range, the kind of weather that passes through central Nebraska several times in a normal summer without leaving any particular mark on it. The kind of weather that a healthy corn crop with intact root systems rides out without incident. The corn in Harlan County did not have intact root systems. Callum heard the storm come in after midnight, the wind building in the west, the rain arriving hard and then steady, the kind of rain that the county needed, and that came 2 weeks too late to help the root systems that had already been compromised. He lay in bed and listened to it, and thought about Hal Denton's fields, about the lean he had seen in the rows, about the math of root mass and wind load that he had never wanted to do. He got up at 5 and drove the county road before the sun came up. What he saw in the gray early light of the 15th of August was a county that had fallen. Not all of it, not even most of it, but the fields with the highest rootworm pressure, the fields where the rotation-resistant variant had built its densest populations, where the larval feeding had been most concentrated, where the root systems had been most severely compromised, those fields were down. The rows that had been leaning were now lying. The corn that had been the height of a tall man in July was bent to the ground in August, the stalks kinked at the crown where the root mass had given way, the ears that had been setting grain now touching the soil. Callum stopped the truck on the county road and got out and stood in the early morning quiet and looked at it. To the east, past 2 intervening fields, he could see the northeast corner of the red farm. The sunflowers were standing. They stood in the gray morning light, the way they had stood through the dry week in June, straight dark, their heads heavy with developing seed, unmoved by the wind that had laid the corn down around them. The 40 acres of sunflowers on the south fence extension were standing too, all 120 acres of the rotation ground standing in a county that had fallen. Callum stood on the road for a long time. He thought about a morning in April of 1987 and a feed store counter and a laugh that had been patient and almost fond. He thought about a green notebook on a passenger seat. He thought about his father saying, "I need to think about it," and his mother saying, "I checked it," and the particular silence of a Tuesday evening in a farmhouse kitchen when you learn something about the people you thought you already knew everything about. He did not feel triumphant. He felt the weight of it, the specific, uncomfortable, irreducible weight of being right about something while the county around you pays the price of being wrong, and knowing that the difference between your field and theirs is not superior virtue or greater intelligence, but 2 years of sticky traps and a rotation plan and a professor in Lincoln who had a phrase he used so often his students wrote it on the inside covers of their notebooks. Callum got back in the truck. He drove home. He went to the kitchen. He put the green notebook on the table and sat down and opened it to the observation log for August 14th and wrote down what he had seen field by field with the distances and the estimated percentage of lodging and the wind direction and the time of observation. Then he turned to a blank page and sat with the pen in his hand for a long time without writing anything. Eldon came in from the barn at 6:30 and poured his coffee and looked at his son at the table and looked at the green notebook and sat down across from him. The Denton ground, Eldon asked. Mostly down, Callum said. The Frey brothers' west field, too. I couldn't see the Bellamy ground from the road, but based on the trap counts from June, I'd estimate significant lodging. Our corn. The rotation-adjacent fields held better, the gradient showed up. We lost yield, but not what they lost. Eldon picked up his coffee. Set it down. How much did we lose? I need to walk the fields to estimate. But based on the root mass assessments I did in July, I'd put us at half the county average loss, maybe less. Eldon looked out the window at the south field. The corn there was bent at the margins, but not prostrate, not what was lying in Hal Denton's field 2 miles south. The sunflowers, Eldon asked. Standing, Callum said. Eldon looked at his son across the table, and the look was not the look of a man who had been proven wrong by events. It was something quieter than that. It was the look of a man who had believed without saying so that his son's careful work would come to something, and who was watching it come to something, and who understood that coming to something this way, while the county fell around it, was not what either of them would have chosen. You were right, Eldon said. His voice was quiet. The kitchen was quiet around it. The rotation, Callum said. The diversification. The data said it. I just read it. Eldon was quiet for a moment, looking at the green notebook on the table between them. Then he looked up, and when he spoke, his voice had the particular character of a man who has been thinking about a thing for a long time and has arrived, finally, and without drama, at where the thinking leads. You decide the rotation, Eldon said. All of it. Whatever you think is right. Callum looked at his father. Outside, the morning light was coming up over the south field. The standing corn at the margin caught it first, the stalks that had held, because the ground beneath them had been given something different than what the rest of the county had given theirs. Beyond the field, past the fence line and the gravel road, the rest of Harlan County lay in the August light, leaning and fallen and irretrievably changed. The green notebook was open on the table between them. Callum picked up the pen. The harvest of 1989 came in under a sky that had gone the particular pale blue of a Nebraska autumn, the kind of blue that looks almost white at the horizon and deepens overhead into something that has no name in any catalogue Callum had ever read. The sunflowers came off first, the way they always did, Irvstout's header running through the northeast corner and the south fence extension in 2 long days, the seed flowing into the grain cart with a sound like slow water, steady and unhurried and full. 1,580 pounds per acre on the northeast corner. The south fence extension came in at 1,460. The price had moved, 12 cents a pound at the Kearney elevator, up from 11 the previous year, moved by a processing market that had been quietly expanding while the feed store counter in Alma discussed whether sunflowers could even be sold out of Harlan County. Callum netted $119 per acre after inputs and hauling. His father's corn on the best ground on the farm, the deep soil bottom fields that had not been touched by the worst of the rootworm pressure, netted $68 per acre. The sunflower ground had outperformed the best corn ground on the farm by $51 per acre, in a year when the county had been devastated. Callum sat at the kitchen table that October and opened the green notebook and put the numbers side by side, and he did not feel what he had expected to feel. He had thought in the abstract that this moment would feel like arrival, like the completion of an argument, like the data finally saying loudly enough for everyone to hear what it had been saying quietly since 1987. It didn't feel like that. It felt quiet. It felt like the particular stillness of a field after harvest. The stalks cut, the grain gone, the ground open to the sky, everything that had been growing now reduced to its essential record. What happened here, what it cost, what it gave back. The green notebook had 340 pages of that record now, and the record said what it said. And the saying of it did not require anything from Callum, except that he keep writing it down. Eldon sat across the table and looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he looked up, and his eyes held something that Callum would spend years finding the right word for. Not pride exactly, not vindication, something older than either of those things. The look of a man who has revised something fundamental, not because he was wrong about the facts, but because the world had brought him a set of facts he had not had before, and he had been honest enough to let them change him. "You were right," Eldon said. "The data was right," Callum said. "I just read it." Eldon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the green notebook on the table, at the worn cover, and the pages swollen with 2.5 years of observation. Then he said what he had been building toward since February of 1987, since the first time he had picked up the notebook and turned its pages slowly, since the morning in the barn when he had told his son about the sunflowers of 1971 and what the silence around that failure had cost them both. "You decide the rotation," Eldon said. "All of it. Whatever you think is right. Starting with next spring. Not 80 acres, not 120. All of it." Callum looked at his father and understood that this was not a concession. A concession implied resistance overcome. This was something else, a man who had spent his life being the authority on a piece of ground, deciding with full deliberateness that the authority had moved, and being at peace with where it had moved to, because the ground itself had shown him why. That was the moment the farm changed. Not the harvest numbers, not the storm, not the rootworm counts on the trap maps. The moment the farm changed was when Eldon Red, who had farmed 480 acres in Harlan County for 15 years, the way his father had farmed them before him and his grandfather before that, set the green notebook back on the table and pushed it gently toward his son. Callum picked it up, turned to a blank page, wrote the date at the top. He began the rotation plan for 1990. The news traveled the way news travels in a small county, not through any announcement, not through any deliberate telling, but through the elevator in Kearney that mentioned the red yield to someone who mentioned it at the co-op in Alma, and through the county extension office report published in November that cited the red farm specifically as an example of diversified rotation showing measurably reduced pest pressure in a year of significant county-wide rootworm damage. 2 different farmers drove past the red northeast corner in early October after the sunflowers had come off and looked at the clean harvested ground, the way you look at something that requires you to revise a belief you have held for a long time without examining it. Dale Cutler had a hard autumn. His customers had lost money. Some of them had lost a great deal of money, the kind of money that required a conversation with a bank, the kind of conversation that changes the way a man looks in the morning. Dale had sold them the insecticide programs and the hybrid selections and the nitrogen schedules, all of it calibrated correctly for a corn county doing what a corn county did, all of it insufficient for what a corn county had built for itself over 20 years of perfect, unvarying monoculture. He had given them the best advice he knew how to give, and the advice had not been enough. He knew it had not been enough, and the man at the feed store counter knew it too, in the way that small communities know things not loudly, not unkindly, but with the persistent, unignorable knowledge of people who have watched the same ground from the same roads their whole lives and cannot pretend not to see what they have seen. Dale Cutler drove out to the Red Farm on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after harvest. He parked his truck at the end of the lane and walked up to the house and knocked on the door, and Callum answered it, and Dale stood on the porch with his cap in both hands and said he wondered if Callum had a few minutes to talk. Callum looked at him for a moment, at the cap in his hands, at the particular quality of a man's face when he has driven 15 miles to have a conversation he does not know how to begin. "Come in," Callum said. They sat at the kitchen table, the same oak table, the same window looking south over the field, the same scratches and stains that had been accumulating since 1958. Rosalie was not in the kitchen. Eldon was in the barn. It was just the two of them, and the green notebook on the table between them, and the grey November light coming through the window over the sink. Dale said he had been looking at the numbers from the season. He said he was thinking about what he would be recommending to his customers going forward. He said he thought he needed to understand the rotation work better than he did, and that the Red Farm seemed like the right place to start. Callum looked at him for a moment. Then, "Do you remember what you said at the feed store in April of 1987? Dale looked at the table. "I remember," he said. "You said sunflowers in a corn county." Callum's voice was even without heat, like it was the punchline to a joke. "I know what I said. I'm not saying it to embarrass you," Callum said. "I'm saying it because the lesson isn't that sunflowers are better than corn. That's not what the data says, and that's not what this farm shows. The lesson is that any operation that grows only one thing is an operation that needs only one disaster to fail. That's what the field trial said in 1987. That's what the rootworm said in 1989. And it'll say it again in a different form in a different year, and the farms that are still standing when it does will be the ones that had the rotation in place before it arrived." Dale was quiet. He looked at the green notebook on the table, then back at Callum. "What would you recommend," he said carefully, "for a 600-acre corn-soybean operation? Someone like Hal Denton." Callum opened the green notebook. They talked for 2 hours. Dale asked questions, and Callum answered them, and when he didn't know the answer, he said so and told Dale where to find it: the extension bulletin number, the university trial report, the specific paper from Dr. Varden that addressed the question most directly. He gave Dale copies of the Illinois field trial data and the Minnesota revenue study, the same papers he had opened to the revenue comparison table at the feed store counter in April of 1987, the ones Dale had looked at without reading. Dale took them. He folded them carefully and put them in the inside pocket of his jacket. When he stood to leave, he looked at the green notebook on the table. "Could I borrow that for a few days?" he asked. Callum said he would make him a copy. That was the first twist at the end of this story. Not Dale's arrival on the porch, which Callum had half expected since August, but what Dale said as he was putting on his coat at the door, said quietly and without ceremony, the way a man says something he has been carrying for a long time and is finally ready to set down. "The best agronomic advice I've given in 19 years, Dale said, came from a 22-year-old with a green notebook. And I laughed at it." He paused with his hand on the door. "That's going to cost my customers." more than I like to think about." He left. Callum stood at the kitchen window and watched the truck go down the lane and turn onto the county road and disappear. Then he went back to the table and sat down and opened the green notebook and wrote the date and wrote what Dale had said word for word, because some things deserve to be in the record. The years that followed moved the way good years move, not dramatically, but with the steady accumulation of small right decisions made in sequence. In 1994, farms in the northeast quarter of Harlan County added sunflowers or small grains to their rotation. In 1991, it was 9 farms, and Hal Denton was among them, adding oats and a 40-acre sunflower plot on his sandy upland ground, the ground that had been the worst of his rootworm damage in 1989. By 1993, Hal's per-acre net on the diversified ground was running $28 above his corn-soybean average, and he said so at the feed store counter one Thursday morning without particular drama, the way you say something that has become simply true. Nobody laughed. In the fall of 1993, the Harlan County Extension Office published a rotation guide for diversified systems in central Nebraska that drew substantially on data from the Red Farm. The guide cited the Green Notebook's observation logs by date. It cited the sticky trap gradient maps. It cited the nitrogen fixation data from the vetch strip, now in its 6th year, the organic matter percentage on the drainage ground rising steadily in a direction the extension agronomist had told Callum carefully might not be fully replicable. The sample said it was replicating. Callum was asked to present his findings at the winter meeting of the Harlan County Farm Bureau a Thursday evening in January, the kind of meeting that drew 200 farmers on a cold night because the topic was money, and the county had learned in August of 1989 what the topic of money could become when you weren't paying attention to it. He stood at a podium in a room that smelled of coffee and wet wool, and the particular warmth of a large group of people who have come in from the cold, and he put the 1989 per acre comparison on the screen behind him, the sunflower numbers and the corn numbers side by side, the same way he had put them in the green notebook that October evening at the kitchen table, and he told the story of the rotation the way the green notebook told it, with dates and measurements and the specific unhurried language of data that has been carefully collected over time. He talked for 40 minutes. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when people are listening with their full attention, without the particular restlessness of an audience waiting for a speaker to finish. When he was done, the room applauded. Eldon Red was sitting in the 3rd row. When the applause began, Eldon stood up. He didn't say anything. He didn't raise his hand or nod or make any gesture beyond the simple act of rising from his chair in the 3rd row of the Harlan County Farm Bureau meeting while his son stood at the podium. The room kept applauding. Callum stood at the podium and did not move for a moment. He looked at his father, at the particular uprightness of a man who does not stand easily, who does not make gestures lightly, who had spent 30 years letting the ground speak for itself rather than speaking for it. Eldon's hands were at his sides. He was not clapping. He was simply standing the way a field stands after a good harvest, quietly, without needing to say what it gave. Callum saw him, and the seeing of it stopped something in his chest for a moment, the particular stopping of a thing that has been held in tension for a long time and is finally quietly allowed to rest. That was the climax of this story. Not the numbers on the screen, not the applause. The moment a father stood up in a room of 200 people and said with his whole body, without a single word, "This is my son, and he was right, and I am proud of him in a way I do not have language for." Callum put it in the green notebook that night. Not the applause, not the slide, just 3 words. Dad stood up. Dale Cutler came to that meeting. He sat in the back row and listened to the full presentation and said nothing during the question period. But afterward, in the parking lot, in the cold January air, with his breath showing white, he found Callum and told him that he had changed his standard rotation recommendation to include a third crop option for all customers with sandy or poorly drained ground. That he had taken the case to his seed company representative using Callum's data, that the representative had been resistant at first and then had read the numbers and stopped being resistant. He said it without ceremony, the way a man says something he has thought about for a long time and is finally ready to say out loud. Callum thanked him. He meant it. And then the second twist, the one that closed the circle on everything that had come before. Dale reached into his jacket and took out the copies Callum had made for him in November of 1989, the Illinois field trial data and the Minnesota revenue study, folded and refolded many times over 4 years, the creases worn soft, the margins filled with Dale's own handwriting, notes, questions, calculations in a different hand from Callum's, the same data, arriving at different places from the same starting point. Dale held them out. "I've been using these for 4 years," he said. "I made my own copies a long time ago. These should go back to where they came from." Callum took the papers. He looked at Dale's handwriting in the margins, the questions Dale had asked himself over 4 years of changing the way he worked, the calculations he had run for his customers, the specific numbers he had circled in the Minnesota table, different numbers from the ones Callum had circled, arriving at the same conclusion from a different angle. He folded the papers and put them in the green notebook in the back behind the observation logs. They were there when he drove home that night. They were there the next morning when he opened the notebook at the kitchen table to write the date at the top of a new page. They were there in the spring of 1997 when the notebook had become the 6th volume in a series that lived on the shelf above the desk in the room off the kitchen next to Eldon's leather ledgers. Let me tell you about the spring of 1997, because the story has one more turn, and it is the turn that gives the whole thing its shape. Callum had married June Wren in 1992, a farmer's daughter from Phelps County, who had grown up in fields not entirely unlike these, and who had, within a year of moving to the red place, begun keeping her own set of records in a plain brown notebook that she cross-referenced with the green one. They had a daughter born in the rotation years, a child who had grown up knowing the difference between a sunflower field and a cornfield before she knew how to read. Her name was Nora. In the spring of 1997, Nora was 8 years old and already following her father through the fields the way Callum had followed Eldon, asking questions that required thought before answering the kind of questions that meant she was watching rather than just looking. One April evening, Nora came home from school with a library book. She sat down at the kitchen table, the oak table, the same one, its surface worn smooth now in the places where hands had rested over 40 years, and she set the book open in front of her father. "Hemp," she said. "It's a rotation crop. Look." The book was from the county library, published in 1995, a practical guide to industrial hemp production in Canada with a chapter on soil health effects. Nora had dog-eared 3 pages. She pointed to the first one. Deeper root system than sunflowers, she said. Fixes more organic matter per acre than vetch. And there's a federal pilot program. Now Iowa's on the list. Nebraska too. Callum looked at his daughter. She was 8 years old and she had a library book with 3 dog-eared pages. And she was pointing to data, the way he had pointed to data at a kitchen table in the spring of 1987, 10 years and 6 notebook volumes ago, when the world had seemed simple in its resistance and complicated in its possibilities. He thought about a Thursday morning in April of 1987, a feed store counter, the patient, almost fond laugh of a man who had never needed to read a study because the ground had always done what the ground had always done. The green notebook on the passenger seat of his truck on the county road going home. He thought about his father standing up in the 3rd row. He thought about monoculture is a loan you take out against disaster, written on the inside cover of the first green notebook, underlined twice, still there in the box in the barn where the original volumes lived. He looked at Nora. "Show me the data," he said. Nora turned to the first dog-eared page. Callum leaned over and read it. Then he stood up and went to the shelf and took down the 7th green notebook, new unopened, the cover still bright, the pages still flat and unmarked. He sat back down at the table and opened it to the first page and wrote the date at the top. April 14th, 1997. "Okay," he said, "let's start from the beginning." June Wren was sitting in the corner of the kitchen with her coffee, her brown notebook open on her knee, her pen in her hand. She had not said a word through any of this. She watched her husband and her daughter at the kitchen table with the green notebook open between them and the library book beside it, and she smiled the particular smile of a person who has seen the shape of something and recognized it, who knows that the story she's inside has been going on longer than she has and will go on longer than she will, and who finds that fact not diminishing, but the opposite of diminishing. The Red Farm still runs 480 acres in the northeast corner of Harlan County, Nebraska. The rotation changes the way the rotation has always changed, as the data changes, as the markets shift, as the knowledge accumulates from one season to the next and one notebook to the next. The sunflower ground is still in sunflowers, mostly, though some of it rotates through winter wheat now, and 2 of the sandiest acres in the northeast corner have been in the hemp pilot for 2 seasons and are being watched with the same careful daily attention that Callum brought to the first sunflower planting in May of 1987. The organic matter on those sandy acres has risen from 1.8% in 1987 to 3.1% today. The county extension agronomist who reviewed the soil samples last fall said carefully that the rate of change was outside the normal range for that soil type in that time frame. The soil samples say it happened anyway. Dale Cutler retired in 2001. In a small article in the Alma newspaper about his 19 years in the seed and chemical business, he said that the best agronomic advice he had ever received had come from a 22-year-old with a green notebook, and that he had been slow to listen, and that the slowness had cost his customers more than he liked to think about. He said he hoped the farmers coming up behind him would be faster than he had been. Not because the young are always right, but because the data doesn't care how long you've been doing something. It only cares what the numbers say. The Green Notebook is on its 7th volume. The first one lives in a box in the barn. Its cover faded, its pages stiff with years, the inside cover still readable in Callum's handwriting from the spring of 1987. The sentence is still there, underlined twice. The way something gets underlined when you write it down, not to remember it, but because you already know it is true and you want the knowing of it to be permanent, to outlast the season, to be there for whoever opens the box next. Some knowledge is like that. It doesn't belong to the person who first writes it down. It belongs to the person who reads it and acts on it, and then to the person they pass it to, and then to the person after that. The Green Notebook is not a record of what Callum read knew. It is a record of what the ground knew, what it had always been capable of, given the chance, given the rotation, given the room to be more than one thing. That is what Nora will find when she opens it, what her children will find after her. Not a corn county, not a sunflower county, a farm that learned season by season to grow what the ground asked for and to listen when the data changed. The notebook is still open. If there's someone in your life who looked at a new idea with patience instead of dismissal, who said, "Show me the data," instead of "That's not how we do things here," we'd love to hear about them in the comments. And if this story meant something to you tonight, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it.